This week we're going to start with Chapter 3, the Intervention and Assessment Models. We're going to look at the triage assessment system, and we're going to look at the form. At the end of this PowerPoint, you're going to see the form that I've included under your lesson and is also in your textbook. Quickly though, I just want to go through just a few little quick things from Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 that I think are really important. The first thing is in your text on page 21, the characteristics of an effective helper. Somebody who can deal with crisis is able to kind of keep calm in the face of somebody else's emotional breakdown. So you have to have a lot of poise, and even though you may internally be feeling tense and frightened and anxious, it's really important that you continue to breathe and kind of keep yourself together. It's also important to be really creative and flexible. When you're a social worker, things are going to come at you a million miles an hour. So it's really important that you understand that there is no formula for getting the right answer. There are lots of different ways to come up with solutions, and so it's important to really be able to think outside of the box, bring in other people's ideas, consult supervisors if you need to. Being able to have good energy and be resilient, you got to be able to roll with the punches and kind of understand that there's a lot of ups and downs in this kind of work. You have to be able to be assertive and really speak clearly into what you think is important. In Chapter 2, they look at culturally effective helping. I would say it's important to understand high context and low context cultures and some of the barriers to overcoming cultural differences. So those are just a couple quick things. And now we're going to start into Chapter 3, Intervention and Assessment Models. Really, this purpose of this chapter is really to look at applied crisis intervention models. So here we go. Like we've already said, we have to look at the severity of a crisis, and that's kind of hard to do because everybody's different. Everybody responds to crisis differently. But we have to do that quickly or rapidly with a systematic approach, which is the rules of the road from your workbook. And it has to be very intentional because we're trying to get to the heart of the matter. 3 things that we're trying to support the client in gaining is equilibrium. Equilibrium is a state of mental or emotional stability, balance, or poise. So we're trying to help them get back to balance, help them move or be mobility. It's the state of physical being in which a person can autonomously change or cope in response to different moods, feelings, and emotions. In other words, they're not stuck. And then autonomy. Autonomy is the idea that they have the right to choose for themselves how they're going to respond to what's going on in their lives. If you think of any crisis in your own life, these are the 3 things that you need to be able to move on from whatever the crisis is. The idea that we believe we can do it ourselves, that we can move forward, we're not going to get stuck here, and that it will get better and we will find balance one day. So in this text book, the authors really talk about how when they first wrote this hybrid model of crisis intervention, they looked at crisis intervention as a linear or a stage model. You start in stage 1 and you go step by step through stage 6. What they've now discovered is that is indeed not the way people work. We don't always move from one stage to the next. So now they've added in the fact that there's a lot of different ways that people can react. But that the tasks are the foundation for this model. So the first task we talk about is just the engaging or initiating contact. In other words, will the person that's in crisis really want to engage with us as their worker? Sometimes people in crisis are not all that enthusiastic about our coming into their life. So they might not want to talk. They might be out of control. They're not even aware of your presence. Some people in a serious mental illness crisis will not know where they are. So we have to be engaging with people in a way that clients will be receptive to our intervention. So we have to very quickly establish a therapeutic bond and inform the client about what they are what they can expect. We have to clarify our intentions with regard to what's going to happen. So how do you establish a psychological bond or a connection with somebody? How do you do that? That's pretty much the question that most students want to know. Most importantly, we want to be calm. We want to be slowly speaking to somebody in a calm voice with an open body. When you were in Principles of Interviewing and Counseling, you might have been told by your teacher, because I teach that class, that you want to match the tone and the cadence of your client's speech. In this case, it's somebody in crisis. It's very important to be very calm, very grounded, very centered. You want to introduce yourself. You want to ask their name, use their name, and maintain good eye contact. You want to use those basic listening skills and open-ended questions. You will have to use some closed-ended questions just to get the facts of the situation. But basic listening skills include those open-ended questions, using silence when it's appropriate, paraphrasing or reflecting the content of what somebody is saying to you, empathy, which is reflecting feeling back to them. So those are just a few of the basic listening skills. You want to clarify your intentions, like I said before, and allow the client to cathart without escalation. Catharsis is really ventilation, or this idea of expressing themselves. Let them vent about what's happened. It's really, really important when you're exploring what the problem is. The major task of crisis intervention is to define and understand the problem from the client's point of view, not from your point of view. And you're really going to use core listening skills in this. You're going to use empathy, which is understanding how the person feels about their situation. Genuineness means, I really care about you and I really want to see things improve for you. And acceptance or positive regard. Depending on what's happened in their life, they may feel attacked by everyone around them. So it's really important that they know that you are there to help them. You do not need a complete history of their life. You do not need to identify the precipitating event to the crisis. At this point, you're just trying to figure out in this moment what the problem is. So how do you provide support? That's the third task. It's really important when you're providing the support that these people that are in front of you that are in crisis know that you are concerned for them. When they look at you, you want them to be able to say, here's one person who really cares about me. We want to provide psychological support, which is no matter what they've done or what they've been through, unconditional positive regard. Just the fact that they're a human being and they're in crisis is enough for you to care about them. So using empathic responses, reflecting feelings, and owning statements about the client's present condition can really bond you together in this crisis. It really says something when you can say, I'm right here with you. I'm going to walk you through this process. That's a really powerful statement for providing support. Logistical support. Sometimes people do not have instrumental or informational. They don't know how to get food, clothing, shelter, money. They could be out of all sorts of resources, and that's a true crisis. So they're going to need education and resources. Social support, examining the client's primary support systems. They might not have the resources. They might not be easily accessible, or they might not be willing to call a neighbor or a friend, church members, co-workers. So those are all important things to look at, what kinds of support you can provide. Task 4 is, and before we go to task 4, let's talk about your task throughout every bit of crisis intervention is to look at safety. Safety is always on your mind as a crisis worker. It is very, very important, both for your own personal safety and for the safety of the client. You always want to make sure that they are in a safe place or that you are safe if they're out of control. It means assuring the client that they're psychologically safe too. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to do anything to harm them. Safety is key, and it's going to be pounded into you throughout the semester. Okay, moving on to task 4. Clients often think in a crisis that they have no options, or they develop tunnel vision. They can only see what's right ahead of them, or they can only see the problem that they're facing. So it's very important to let them know that they're not alone and that you have ideas. I have an idea. I've helped other people in this situation. Here are some ideas that I've used in the past. Here are some people that I know. This helps people understand that you have something to offer or bring to the table. There are 3 key components for looking at alternatives. What are the situational supports that are already in place? What are their coping mechanisms? If something like this has happened to you before, how have you handled it? Right? So what are their actions, behaviors, the environmental resources that they might use to help them get through their present crisis? And then positive thinking patterns. These are a part of the way the clients can reframe or their view of the problem and lessen their level of stress and anxiety. So you really want to be able to brainstorm lots and lots of different ideas, but not on your own. Many times the clients can help you with that. So you want to brainstorm those alternatives, and it's a continuous process with rapidly changing conditions. So the task 5 is planning in order to reestablish control. So somebody in a crisis is feeling the loss of control, and chaos is kind of reigning in all areas of their life, or every major effort that they've had to manage their situation has failed. So reestablishing control means helping the client create a plan to guide them in the resolution of the crisis. Remember, the first 3 steps are really about listening. The last 3 steps are really about helping them act. So one of the primary strategies is for reestablishing control is mobilizing the client. So how do we get them to make plans that are logical, from the alternatives that they've created in task number 4. So the first thing is you really want to help them identify additional persons, groups, other referral sources that can be contacted for immediate support. And then the second thing is providing coping mechanisms, something concrete and positive for the client to do now. Definite, defined action steps that they can own and comprehend and that they agree to. A good plan needs to be developed by the client, needs to be clear, realistic, specific, and immediate. I'm going to do this today when I get home for this much time. A plan allows the client to establish autonomy and become mobile. So some of it is just being able to move forward and know that they can do it by themselves. Before we go to task 6, one last thing I want you to know about is psychoeducation. Psychoeducation takes place during that planning time in stage 5, and it's really about providing information to victims or survivors about what's happening, probably what's going to happen to them psychologically in the aftermath if there's been a traumatic event. So it's really about giving them expectations of this is normal if you start feeling this way. So that's part of the last task. So if the task 5 was, if planning was done effectively, obtaining commitment to this last step of the plan is going to be pretty easy. It may be simply having the client verbally summarize the plan. If lethality is involved, in other words, if there's a threat to harm themselves or others, a commitment may be needed in writing and signed by both parties. If there's any hesitation, the crisis worker may need to revisit the earlier tasks. Again, like I said before, these stages are not linear. They can go back and forth. So if there's any hesitation when you get to task 6 about obtaining commitment, then you need to go back. It's their plan. If they are not willing to agree with it, then there's some part of the plan that needs to be revisited. In regular therapy, we often schedule weekly sessions or bi-weekly sessions or monthly sessions. In crisis intervention, you may need to talk to them in like an hour. You may need to see them day by day until the crisis kind of resides. So it's really about understanding the client's ability to maintain that forward motion or mobility and seek balance in their life. Again, this crisis worker, the role of a crisis worker is to support the client and really help them understand that you are with them, that they do not go alone. Assessment is the key to crisis intervention, and it's always ongoing. This allows the crisis worker to evaluate the severity of the situation, the client's emotional, behavioral, and cognitive status, the client's level of mobility, their safety and the success of the worker and de-escalating the situation. If you have your textbook on page 59, you'll see the kind of the crisis workers continuum. There's this big figure 3.1, the model of crisis intervention, has those tasks that we just discussed, and then underneath of that, you'll see where it says crisis workers action continuum. Again, that's on page 59 of your text. So the crisis worker is non-directive over on the left, and then the crisis worker is collaborative in the middle, and then the crisis worker is directive. So you'll see that this is directly opposite of the client. If you're a crisis worker, you don't have to be very direct if the client is mobile and able to speak, able to come up with their own plans. If the client is partially mobile, then the crisis worker can be collaborative. If the client is totally paralyzed and immobile, then the crisis worker needs to be more directive. So the crisis worker's level of action and involvement may be anywhere on the continuum according to the assessment of mobility and immobility. Factors then can impact one's emotional stability. How long has this crisis been taking place? What's the degree of emotional resilience or stamina that the person has? What is the ecosystem in which the client resides? How supportive are the people in their life? What's the developmental stage of the client? Where are they in their life? Okay, this semester we're going to use something called the triage assessment form. I'm going to introduce it to you this week. You may have already been introduced to it, I don't know, but I'm going to pretend like you weren't, and we're going to start from the beginning. This is just an effective method for obtaining real-time assessment of the client's affective or emotional, behavioral, or cognitive or thought process, okay? It can be performed quickly by a wide spectrum of crisis workers, police officers, school counselors, volunteer crisis line workers, people in colleges. It informs the crisis worker of the current state of the client and their own ability to de-escalate. At the end of this PowerPoint, you'll see we call it the TAF form. So ABCs of triage assessment: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. Often the first sign of disequilibrium can manifest as overly emotional or withdrawn. So we really want to understand how long, that crisis is time limited, and most acute crises persist only a matter of days or weeks, except maybe a larger scale disaster. So if somebody's over emotional or out of control or severely withdrawn or detached, we have to really try to help the client express their feelings in an emotional, in a realistic way to gain control. Incongruities about what the client says and how they say it, or nonverbal behaviors, should always be listed or should always be noted, rather. Key questions to ask: do people typically show this kind of affect in a situation such as this? Behavioral functioning focuses on ways to get the client to become mobile by positive actions that the client can take at once. People who cope with crisis successfully and later evaluate their experiences favorably report that the most helpful alternative during a crisis is to engage in some kind of concrete or immediate activity. It's important for the worker to remember that it may be difficult for immobilized people to take independent or autonomous action, even though it's what they need to do the most. So the most appropriate questions a worker can ask for behavioral functioning is: in cases like this in the past, what actions did you take that helped get you back in control? Or what would you have to do now to get back on top of the situation? Or is there anyone who, if you contacted them right now, would be supportive to you in this crisis? So the fundamental problem in immobility is a loss of control. Cognitive state, how realistic and consistent is the client's thinking about this crisis? To what extent does the client appear to be rationalizing their behavior, exaggerating, or believing part truths or rumors? And how is that affecting the crisis? How long has the client been engaged in crisis thinking? How open does the client seem to be towards changing their beliefs about the situation or reframing it? So it's really important to look at what are their thoughts about the crisis, It's either perceived as a transgression, which is something that happened in the past, a threat, which is something in the future, or a loss, which is, transgression is the present, loss is the past. All right, so how do we rate clients using the TAF? So it's a backwards scale. So in other words, it's a backwards rating process that can seem confusing at first glance, but the idea is that we rule out more severe impairments first. So we're going to rate affect. We would first look at whether the client fits any of the descriptors under severe impairment. If not, we would then consider the descriptors under marked impairment. If we're able to check that off, at least half of those descriptors, then the clients would receive a rating of 9. If we could identify fewer than half of the descriptors, the clients would receive an 8. We would repeat this rating process through all the dimensions until we get a total rating. The score ranges from 3 to 30. People from 3 to 10 are under minimal impairment, and these clients are generally self-directing, able to function effectively on their own. The rating of 11 to 19 means that clients are more impaired and they may have difficulty functioning on their own and need help and direction. Clients with a total score of 20 or above are moving deeper into harm's way, and they're likely to need greater direction and a secure and safe environment. Scores in the high 20s almost always mean that some degree of lethality is involved, whether it is premeditated or the clients are simply out of control, that they cannot stay out of harm's way. The rating clients on the triage scale also means rating the crisis worker. If the worker is effective in stabilizing the client, the score should go down. If it does not, then the worker probably needs to shift gears and try another approach. So one rating issue that constantly arises is the question, what do you mean by severe? Shouldn't a mother who gets news that her son is badly injured in a school bus accident be pretty hysterical and out of control? And yes, they should. But what puts the mother into the crisis category and allows us to rate her as severely impaired on the TAF involves two things. Even though feelings, thoughts, and behaviors can seem reasonable in horrific situations, what kind of potential trouble does that get the mother into? Are her feelings and thoughts and actions going to exacerbate the situation, make it worse? Or it's not just the intensity, but also how long or the duration of the feelings, thoughts, and actions. We might reasonably expect the initial response to be highly volatile, but after 4 hours, the same degree of emotional energy, if it were still present, it would be obvious that the client's out of control and in need of assistance. So throughout your text this week and part in chapter 3, there are different, there's a scenario with the man named Laron, and it's all through part 1 through 3. So pages 52 is where it starts, and then it ends on page 58. So go ahead and read just their little paragraphs in the middle about Laron. So go ahead and read through those scenarios, and then you can answer these questions. This is going to be your case study for this week. I would like you to read through that, and then there'll be questions. You're going to answer these questions in the discussion forum and see what your fellow classmates had to say. This is the triage assessment form. You're going to find it under your lessons this week, but you'll see how you can fill it out. You'll identify and describe the crisis situation. I want you to do that for Laron's situation. I want you to describe what it is that his situation was. Look at his affective domain. You're going to look at anger, anxiety, fear, sadness, and melancholy, and then you're going to rate where you think he falls. Give him a number. The same is true of the behavioral domain. What's the approach that he's taken? What has he avoided? Is he immobile? And you're going to give him a number. And then you're going to look here. Is it a transgression, a threat, or a loss? So you can go back in this PowerPoint and look up those definitions. They're also in your chapter. So a transgression looks at what's the present situation with him, what's the threat, and which would be in the future, and what loss has he experienced. And you're going to look at his thought process, his cognitive responses. And then finally, you're going to total up your scores and come up with a total, and you're going to discuss where you think he is in the middle of the crisis. What would the score be if you were his crisis worker?